This is a 10-gallon freshwater aquarium, and I'll be using it to breed a pair of Apistogramma Cacatuoides. In fact, it's the same pair of fish that we've been watching since chapter 1 of this story. This aquarium has a black sand substrate and uses a medium-sized sponge filter. The tank also contains one rock and a single coconut cave. There are several live anubias plants along the back wall, as well as a bit of guppy grass along the front. I've also included some dry leaves from a local forest. These leaves have several benefits. One, they'll make the water a bit more acidic, which these fish prefer. The leaves will also provide lots of hiding places for both the male and the female Apistogrammas. And as these leaves decompose, they'll provide a source of food for countless microorganisms that will become an important part of this tiny ecosystem. I also use a naturalistic aquarium background because it looks better on film and it's a much more natural color scheme for the fish. Now, before we go any further, let's take some time to go over some of the basics about how these fish are put together so that you'll have a better understanding and appreciation of what you're about to see. This is a male Apistogramma Cacatuoides. This is its dorsal fin, and this fin is called the anal fin. Both of these fins help keep the fish stable and upright while it swims. These paired fins on the bottom are the ventral fins, which are also sometimes referred to as the pelvic fins, which is a term that I don't really care for because fish don't have a pelvis. The other set of paired fins just above the ventral fins are the pectoral fins, and these are the fins that are used the most for swimming. This is the tail fin or caudal fin. This large fin is the one that's used for rapid acceleration where sudden bursts of speed are needed, such as when escaping a predator or chasing away an intruder. And now a quick note about the color of their fins. There are several different captive-bred varieties of Apistogramma Cacatuoides that are available for purchase. There's the double-bred Apistogramma that has red on both the dorsal and the caudal fins. Then there's the triple-red variety that has red on the dorsal, the caudal, and the anal fin. And there's also the super red variety, which is sometimes referred to as the quad red. These fish have red on 4 fins, the dorsal, the caudal, the anal, and the ventral fins. Now it's important to note that all of these fish are the same species. They're just different varieties that have been selectively bred to produce varying amounts of red or orange in their fins. And there are no real standards or rules when it comes to naming these different varieties of fish. Furthermore, they're typically purchased as juveniles long before they get all their colors, so you never really know what you're going to get. Wild-caught fish have far less red in their fins and look a lot more like the fish seen here, which for some reason seems to have an anal fin and 2 ventral fins with a bit of light purple on them. And finally, I'd like to point out that the fins that the fish uses the most are completely transparent, which from a camouflage point of view makes perfect sense because these are the fins that move the most, so the less obvious they are, the better. Now, some of you may have heard that fish have a line of special cells on each side of their body known as a lateral line. These cells are called neuromasts, and they can detect the movement of objects in the water. Now, here's a very simple explanation of how the lateral line of a fish works. When something moves in the water, it displaces the water around it, which sends a pressure wave through the water. This wave is detected by tiny hairs inside the neuromass along the lateral line, and the information is then sent to the fish's brain. This allows the fish to determine the location and the size of the object, as well as a whole host of other characteristics about the object's motion. Most fish have a lateral line of one sort or another, which just goes to show you how important it is to the life of a fish. And most seasoned fish keepers have probably heard of the lateral line. However, many people are completely unaware that fish also have a cephalic lateral line system as well. And the word cephalic indicates that this collection of neuromass are located on the head of the fish rather than along the sides. And here you can clearly see the large pores on the head that are part of the cephalic lateral line system. These pores contain the neuromass that detect vibrations and movement, as well as changes in water current and water pressure. These are the fish's nostrils, and cichlids only have 2, while most other fish have 4. The nostrils are used to detect chemical signals in the water that are produced by potential mates, prey items, and possibly even predators. There are also several large pores on the lower side of the head beneath the chin, as well as around the eyes, and all of these sensory organs help the fish to detect movement even when the water is murky or there's very little light. The number and position of these pores are a helpful anatomical feature used by ichthyologists to help them distinguish between similar-looking species of fish. Unfortunately, these large openings are delicate and provide an easy entry point where parasites, bacteria, and even suspended particles in the water column can enter the pores, which can cause them to become clogged and infected. The tissue around these pores then begins to break down and rot, which will cause large sores and pits to form on the fish's head. And in some cases, these sores can also appear along the side of the fish, where the lateral line extends down the length of the body. These lesions can then lead to secondary bacterial and fungal infections around the wound site, which will further complicate any efforts to correct the problem. This condition goes by many names. It's sometimes called hole-in-the-head disease, lateral line erosion, or head and lateral line erosion, but they all refer to the same problem. Many cichlids, especially Oscars, are prone to developing this condition, and there's currently a lot of debate as to the exact cause, but it's very likely that there's more than one reason why some fish develop this problem. Parasites, poor water quality, a heavy bacterial load, poor nutrition, and an excessive amount of suspended particles in the water column have all been blamed for causing this problem. And speaking of problems, about 1 week before I was ready to start filming this male Apistogramma, he got an injury to the right side of his body. I don't know how it happened, and it didn't happen in this tank. He was in a different aquarium, all by himself, and the tank was relatively bare except for a carpet of dwarf Sagittaria and 5 fist-sized pieces of lava rock. So I'm assuming he somehow hurt himself on the sharp edges of the rock. I also noticed that he has a tear in his right pectoral fin, and these 2 injuries might be related. Who knows, but he seems to be healing up just fine. I like to prepare my fish for spawning by giving them lots of protein-rich foods. Live blackworms are a great choice because they're fully aquatic, and any worms that go uneaten will burrow down into the substrate where they'll survive and even reproduce. Nonetheless, this male spent 1 week in this new tank fattening up on live blackworms and baby brine shrimp, while the female was doing the same thing in a different tank. Now, some people like to introduce the female into the breeding tank first so that she can get all settled in and comfortable in her new home before they introduce the male. But in this case, I chose to put the male in first so that he could establish a breeding territory before courting the female, just like he would in the wild. So this male had the breeding tank all to himself for 1 week before I introduced the female. And as I watch this fish eat these baby brine shrimp, I begin to wonder, is this fish using more energy to capture and digest these little shrimp than it's getting in return? Because in real simple terms, if the fish burns 12 calories eating a particular food, and that food only gives the fish 5 calories in return, then there's a net loss of calories. The size difference between these baby shrimp and the fish that's eating them is huge, and he's using a good bit of energy to capture each of these little crustaceans. But I'm not sure how much he's really getting in return. And it's not a situation like a whale shark eating millions of krill or plankton in one gulp of water. This fish is eating these little shrimp one at a time. Now, feeding baby brine shrimp to a fish the size of a neon tetra makes a lot more sense than feeding them to a much larger fish like an Oscar. However, it's often said that lots of small live foods in the water is a great way to trigger fish to spawn. But these particular fish do not need any help breeding because they have babies on a regular basis. But they still love eating their baby brine shrimp, and I like to spoil my fish whenever possible. Unfortunately, these little shrimp can only survive in fresh water for a few hours. And as they weaken, they sink to the bottom where the Apisto can gather several shrimp at once off of the substrate. But this approach often leads to a mouthful of sand. However, that's not a problem for these dwarf cichlids because they're used to finding their food on and even in the substrate. They use special structures behind their gills known as gill rakers that can sift the finer particles of food from the sand or small rocks that they might accidentally pick up while feeding from the bottom. The gill rakers and perhaps even the gills themselves trap the food, and then the rocks and sand are ejected out through the gill cover or spit out through the mouth. Now, for those of you who may be trying to breed a pair of fish that are reluctant to spawn, you may want to put them in separate tanks to condition them before attempting to breed them. Then each day put some of the female's water into the male's tank and some of the male's water into the female's tank, and do this for several days before putting the pair together. During this conditioning period, both the male and the female will release pheromones into the water that act as important signals during the breeding season. The female will sense the presence of the male, and the male will sense that there's a female nearby, and as a result, they'll both start releasing even more pheromones into the water. These pheromones will cause physical as well as behavioral changes in both fish. The female's egg production will increase, and the male's aggressive and territorial nature will become much more pronounced as well. However, all of these changes will be happening while they're still in separate quarters where there's little stress, plenty of space, and lots of food. Then, when these fish are in tip-top condition, you can put them together knowing that they're already familiar with each other's scent and that they've probably been looking for each other. Nonetheless, now that this male has settled into his new home and he knows that there's a female nearby, he's suddenly become very territorial, and he didn't get like this until I started putting water from the female's tank into his tank. So now he figures that he needs to defend this area because he knows that there's a female nearby, and he doesn't want me hanging around when his lady shows up. So he watches me very closely and he repeatedly swims to the front of the tank to try and scare me away. And in the beginning I thought that he was seeing his own reflection in the camera lens, but he does this even when I'm not filming. And it always surprises me how fearless fish can be when they're defending their young. But he's the only fish in this tank, so all of this aggression stems from the fact that he's defending this area so that when a lady fish does show up, she'll feel safe enough to stick around and mate with him. And that concludes this part of the story. But when we get to chapter 6, I'll put the female in the breeding tank with the male, and you really don't want to miss that because this is just going to get better and better as we move along.